A hiker was making his way through the dense woods of a moonlit forest, as he has done many times before. The loosely packed dirt of a trail not yet blazed gave way under his boots as he ventured late into the night. This was far past midnight at this point, and the hiker desperately needed to sleep. The man knelt down and shrugged off his backpack, preparing to set up his tent, until he took note of a light somewhere in the distance. With curiosity piqued, he donned his pack once more to discover the source of the light. As he approached the offending bulb, he began to notice that it wasn't a light by itself, but an entire cottage, lit up somewhat dimly in the dead of the night. Manners be damned, the hiker decided he'd ask the owner of the cottage for some lodging for the night. After all, his tent could be awfully uncomfortable from time to time. However, after several minutes of bare knuckles rapping against solid oak, not a soul answered his call. He continued to knock, and knock, and knock, hoping that somebody was home to shelter him. After a few more bouts of this, the man pursed his lips, quickly making a decision of ethics to sleep outside or intrude without an invitation. What they don't know can't hurt them, the man decided, testing the lock to see if breaking and entering was in order. To his surprise, the door gave way instantly, the hinges eerily creaking as he made himself at home in the cottage. The cottage was simple enough. There was a small kitchen that was attached to a living room, which held nothing but a pull-out couch. It was fairly standard, nothing fancy, but it was better than a tent. The only thing the hiker wasn't comfortable with was an odd sort of collection that the occupant of this cottage had. Some sort of painting collection of disfigured faces with malicious expressions that lined the walls of the room. Each canvas seemed to glare at him with personal hatred and malice that he'd never experienced before. After a few moments of curious staring and cold shivers, the man turned away from the art and tucked himself in for a night's rest. After a few hours of abysmal sleep, the hiker rose with an uncomfortable feeling. He felt uneasy and stood to his feet to gather his belongings before setting off again as quickly as possible. As he packed his bedroll back into his pack, he stared again at the wall once more to gaze upon the odd paintings he had seen the night before. His heart stopped cold as he realized there were only windows. Every time I stay at my grandma's house, I hear someone walking upstairs. It starts at one side of the room, casually walks over to the other, and stops. This will happen maybe twice a night. I didn't start hearing it until I was about 14, when my grandparents made me start sleeping in a different room on the first floor, because they started sleeping in separate bedrooms. I have always been afraid of the upstairs at their house. I don't know why, but it's always freaked me out, and I refuse to ever go up there alone. There's one room specifically though. It's a long, narrow bedroom. When you open the door, there are closets on your left and right, a bed placed roughly in the middle of the room, and a window on the far side opposite the door. I was told growing up by my grandparents that the sons of the previous owner claimed to see a gorilla come out of the closet at night, dance around the room, and then go back into the closet. I thought nothing of this story until I had to start sleeping in the other room, the room located directly below the scary room upstairs. So we all go to bed. All the lights in the house are off, and I'm still awake, lying on the bed. Then I hear it. Thump, thump, thump. Starting at one end of the room upstairs, it got closer to me, passed right above me, and continued to the end of the room where it stopped. I'm wide awake, terrified, out of my mind. It was no question to me that I had heard footsteps. I knew that slow, casual pace I was hearing. I was freaked out and went to my grandpa's room. I told him what I had heard. He told me that the house is old and it creaks, but he turned the dining room light on for me, so I felt a little safer. I tried going back to sleep, and then it started again. this time from where it ended the first time, by the window upstairs. It walks over to me again and stops when it reaches the door. I thought it was over until 5 seconds later when I heard it coming down the stairs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Silence as it reached the landing, then 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and silence again as it reached the first floor. I was frozen in shock. Whatever it was on my floor of the house, and sadly, unaffected by the dining room light. I was starting to look at the doorway to my room. The dining room light was shining in, and my vision began to distort. I felt dizzy with fear, so I pulled the blankets over my head and suddenly heard a scratching sound from inside my room. I knew exactly where it was coming from, too. My grandpa's gun case. It was a very obvious sound, the scratching on the wood, long scratches down the front of the gun case door. I could even hear the door ever so slightly tapping against the frame as each scratch began. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I took a second to take a deep breath and let out a loud scream. In seconds, my grandpa had made it to my room, and I was relieved. Needless to say, he still didn't believe me, so I did what any normal person would do. I draped a sheet over the side of my bed and slept underneath it. I wrapped myself tight in a comforter and put on headphones and turned my back to the door. There could be a party of ghosts in my room, and I wouldn't even know. The next morning, my grandpa told my grandma about what had happened the night before. She said, "Oh, that's silly, you know. Your cousin woke me up the last time she stayed here. She came in my room, saying I hear footsteps. I slept under the bed for the rest of my week stay with them. I've stayed there countless times since that happened, and I hear the footsteps every time. I sleep on top of the bed now, but keep my back to the door and sleep with headphones on. I haven't heard it come downstairs since that first night, but if it does, I don't want to know." When I was about 13 or 14, I lived on a farm in North Carolina. This wasn't a regular farm that you would expect with fields full of beans and shit. It was actually a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and so we lived basically in the woods and would bale the pine tree straw every year. Whatever, the point is that my house was in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined longleaf pine trees. My living room had a huge picture window. I won't go into the architecture of the house, but it was a weird custom job built by some dentist in the 30s. The window in the living room stretched nearly the entire length of the room, maybe 50 feet. The house was built on a subtle hill, so the living room itself sat 5 or 6 feet off the ground, so you had something of an angle to look out at a solid mile of pine trees. During the winter, it was unsettling because you'd just get a bit of snow, enough to reflect the moonlight so that you could see the dogs running around at night. I'll be honest, I hated that room and that window. So now to the relevant part. I had a cousin over for the weekend, and we were doing what kids do in the country, throwing stuff in the fireplace to see what happens. It's getting late, and the fire's dying down, so we build the big kingdom of couch cushions and blankets in the living room and get ready for bed. Nothing out of the ordinary until we hear the dogs barking. They were really far away. The property stretches for nearly a mile, so I just assumed they were chasing off whatever animal felt like shitting in my yard. My cousin is staring out the window and not saying anything, which prompts the standard, "What's up?" He just kind of keeps staring and says he feels like he's seeing things. Naturally, I get all anxious and start staring out the window as well. Nothing happens for a few minutes, and he gets more and more annoyed with me because I'm asking what he saw. He keeps shushing me so that he can focus. And then we both see it. A shadow of a person moves from one tree to the next. Not a run, not a leap, but a brisk walk from one tree to another. This is probably 100 yards out from the house. We can't actually tell if the person is coming closer or not, because we're dealing with the moonlight reflecting off of snow and slush and ice. I guess the crazy part is that we didn't so much freak out, because at this point, there is still the chance that we didn't see what we saw, you know? So we just kept staring. We should have gone to wake up my dad, but he's an idiot, the kind of guy to walk out on the patio and holler into the woods with his rifle. We were just scared enough to agree that we don't want to taunt whatever's happening. So about 3 minutes later, it happens again, but a good 50 feet from where we first saw it. Another person, another tree, a few strides, and they were gone. This happened every few minutes for the next half hour, and we just stared. At this point, I should mention that I didn't really have neighbors. The land surrounding our farm was federal paper, so it was miles and miles of uncultivated trees. You don't see people around the farm unless they intend to be there. So we keep watching as these two figures intermittently appear and vanish until we see one appear but not disappear. Instead, we focus in on it and see that it is now running forward. We lose our shit and go to wake my dad. By the time we get to the room with my half-awake father, there was no one to be seen. We sprint around, locking the doors and windows. Keep in mind, we were out in the country with no one around. It rarely occurs to us to lock doors. Every door was worse than the last, because you think that as soon as you reach it, someone is going to be trying to open it, although that never happened. We locked everything up, walked around the house at least 50 times to make sure no one got in without us knowing, and then convinced my dad to fall asleep in the living room with us while we stared out the window. I never understood why any dad wouldn't call the police. He always had this "we take care of it our own way" mentality, and it simply wasn't an option to call 911. The next day, we went out to look, and absolutely, there were footprints everywhere in the snow. We saw them between the trees, and we finally saw where someone had been standing right in front of the window. But as I said, I wouldn't have seen them, because while I'm 7 feet up in the living room, they would have been right beneath me.